literally, whether it's with your peer or your manager or even just like, your mate at work drinks, and they're not even in your career, it doesn't matter. Like, you, whether you think it or not, like, you are the expert at what you do, right? You have a skill that somebody else doesn't have, and it's just being able to see what you bring to the table, and that's only going to happen if you're talking to someone else.
Anisha, hey, welcome to the Bug Mind. Thank you for joining me. How are you doing today?
Okay, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So before we get into the big topic today, we're talking about imposter syndrome. Like, can you give us a quick introduction about yourself? What do you do in tech?
Yeah, so my job title is developer advocate, and I think that might be a role that not most people might be familiar with. So I'll give a quick explanation. So it's my job to be the developer's best friend, and I work at Amazon. So in my case, it's like making content that makes it easier for developers to build for Amazon devices and App Store, and like getting a feel for what the community wants and needs to make that journey easier, whether that's code samples, demos, articles, you name it. That is sort of like my realm of tech.
Nice. And in terms of producing content, less than a couple of weeks ago, you were on stage at RackConf, is one of the big ones. But you also do smaller talks, personal talks, and one of them was exactly about imposter syndrome, right?
Yeah.
So let's go into the topic. If you had to explain to someone like what is imposter syndrome, how would you do that?
Yeah, I think to me, imposter syndrome is like the fear of being exposed as a fraud. And that can manifest like verbally in many different ways. Like, it might be saying, I don't have the skills, or I'm not good enough, or I don't think I should be here. Like, all those sort of sayings that, people might vocalize is, I think, all just manifestations of imposter syndrome. But it all boils down to that feeling of, I'm a fraud. Like, I don't deserve to be here.
So basically, a lot of thoughts that like your brain produces about yourself that push you down in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably something that a lot of us have experienced in tech. Like it's probably one of the most well-known effects of being in tech. Oh, you're gonna feel imposter syndrome, or I feel imposter syndrome. Like, I know that like as part of your talk, you did have even a categorization of like how some people may experience it. Like, what are these types?
Yeah. So I think like there was a study done, and they categorized like imposter syndrome into like 5 categories, and I'll give you like a brief of the 5.
Yeah.
So like, one is the perfectionist, and I think this is the one we see like most commonly, where it is like the person sets like high standards for themselves, and if they don't reach those high standards, then they feel like that self-doubt or worry or feeling of incompetency, and like no matter how successful they are, like they will never feel satisfied because they're that perfectionist. And then there's the natural genius. So this one is where they believe their self-worth is tied to how naturally they pick up a skill. So like if it takes them a lot of time to pick up a new skill, they might start feeling imposter syndrome, because it's taken too long for them. And then we have the expert. So this type of imposter syndrome is these people feel like before they begin anything, they must know everything going in. So you're not gonna start anything unless you feel like you're completely prepared and experienced. And I think we'll talk about it in a second, but the expert manifests, like, I feel differently for different genders. And a really good study they did was they checked whether they checked men and women applying for jobs, right? And men would apply if they met 60% of the qualifications, but women would only apply if they met 90 to 100% of the qualifications. So you can see like the expert is more so like the type of imposter syndrome that might manifest in women. And then the other two are, the Superman or Superwoman. So I feel like these people push themselves to work harder than those around them. Like, I don't know if you've ever had like people who stay in the office late just because they feel like, okay, I have to be here, otherwise, I'm not getting my job done. And I think that one's a massive one. Like, it might just be taking on too much, like work or even at home, like family tasks. And then the final one is the soloist. So this type of imposter syndrome is when you feel like you have to accomplish tasks just by yourself. Like asking for help means, you're not adequate or you're incompetent. So yeah, there's 5 categories. I don't know, which one do you think you fall into, Lorenzo?
I was thinking about it because every time you started describing one, I was like, okay, I'm definitely this, and then
Yeah.
you're like saying the next one, I was like, oh, I'm definitely this. I think it's also because it can change throughout your
A
career.
100%. Yeah. A hundred
Like
percent.
especially the expert. I think that some people may have heard of being stuck in tutorial hell.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
you just like you need to start working on a feature or a task, something, especially when you're a junior, like, oh, now work on this and you never work on that. And like, okay, I'm gonna take my time and do some learning first, and then like you keep going down. No, I don't feel I learn it enough.
Yeah.
And I think I've experienced that a lot, and especially I think I've got to a point where I was realizing that basically all the learning was giving me nothing. So I kind of like, no, okay, now I actually need to go and do the thing and like learn by doing. I think, yeah, if you're stuck in that one, probably like try do the learn by doing approach. But right now I would probably fit in one of the first two, probably the perfectionist. Like I feel that
Yeah, that's
that's
such an
also another
interesting.
big one in tech.
Yeah, it is
Yeah.
interesting. I think I'm very much the same. Like it
Mm,
was like initially I felt like I had to be the expert, and now it's definitely more the perfectionist as well, which is interesting. Like maybe it is
yeah.
like a beginning of your career versus like when you're in the middle, and maybe it'll change but again later when you have like different responsibilities.
Yeah, and I mean, one other thing that came to mind while you were, describing them is that it almost feels as some of them are kind of like drilled into your brain by your environment. Like, like you mentioned, the not asking for help one,
Yeah,
and it's like I can feel that as something like, oh, it's because you're in a company or in a team where there's a lot of competition, and like if you ask for help you're actually getting, oh, someone is taking a note about me asking for help and they're going to demote me. Like I don't know how much that is by your environment or you projecting that, but I really feel that your workplace probably plays a big role in like how much imposter syndrome you feel, and especially which category. So it's for sure like a thing that is very intertwined with your career in a way. And we'll be talking a bit, about work.
yeah.
Like, but how about you? Like you mentioned, feeling more or less the same. But like, how do you deal with imposter syndrome? How have you dealt with imposter syndrome throughout your career?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, like workplace is one of the biggest factors, I think, and that is what I stress a lot, even in my talk or like when I talk about imposter syndrome, is creating that healthy workspace. I think is the key way to deal with it. Making people talk about it. Like if you're at work, just have a round table, talk through, like hear from different people. It's not just going to be you that and I think that was a key thing for me, realizing that it's not just me that feels this way. Like the CTO, like I mean at my old company, like the CTO like gave a talk and he said it himself, like I feel this way all the time. I feel that way all the time. Like you might see me on stage, yeah, at ReactConf, but like right before going on stage I'm like, like am I the right person to be doing this talk? Like do I even know enough? And it's just hearing people say those things that makes you feel reassured that like your mentors also go through it, and just making that conversation like open and honest and seeing how other people deal with it. So for me, yeah, personally, talking about it is the only way that's like really helped me.
Yeah, and that's also like why we're here. Like
Exactly. Yeah.
hopefully, us talking about it a bit more openly will help some people. And like I think probably like the biggest case of imposter syndrome ever is like the classic anecdote from Neil Gaiman saying that he
Yes.
was at an event with like a black tie event, like whole super famous people, and then he sits down next to literally one of the 3 people that have been on the moon. No, I think in total it was more. But anyway, one of the 3
Yeah.
original people that have been on the moon. And that guy, Neil Armstrong, being like, yeah, I still feel imposter syndrome. I don't know why I'm here.
Yeah.
Like, if even him, like he literally went to the moon and back.
Yes.
Like he's feeling it. it's probably something that a lot of us experience in many different ways. But I think that especially when we were doing research for this episode, like we literally started like looking a bit into the history, and I was super surprised to find that initially imposter syndrome was diagnosticated or found in the 70s in high achieving women, high performing women at work. And I cannot help but feel that in conjunction with another article that you found about, on the BBC about how imposter syndrome affects women and women of color harder, like it literally plays a role, not just like how we feel, but also like our work life. Like we keep going back to work, and like how would you, if you had to explain to someone like imposter syndrome is important, this is why you should take care of it from a career perspective, like what things it could affect in your opinion?
Yeah, like, and then I think it goes back to that example I gave you, right? Like, where if you women might tend to feel like more like the expert. Like, I need to meet this criteria to even just apply for the job. And I think that's where it starts. It starts from the bottom level of just even applying for jobs. If women are only applying because they meet 90% of the criteria, whereas men are applying if they meet 60% of the criteria, you're going to have that divide in the amount of people that are applying. If I saw a job like that was like, oh, you need like minimum 3 to 5 years experience, I'm not applying if I don't have 3 to 5 years experience, whether like that means like in my university experience or not. Like if I don't have like career experience, I know myself, like I'll be more inclined to not apply. And so I think it might even be one of the factors is like why we see like such a lack of women in tech. It might just be starting from that bottom line of like they don't want to apply because they don't meet the criteria. But it's not just like, it's not just applying. I also feel like it's during your career, maybe you might not go for opportunities, or you might not go for like promotion or something because you feel like, okay, I don't meet this criteria. And that one is not just women, that's across the board. I feel like, if you're not feeling like the expert, or you're not feeling, or you have the perfectionist mentality of imposter syndrome, you're not going to be going for that next step in your career unless you are meeting all the criteria you hold yourself accountable to, regardless of whether your boss thinks like, yeah, you're ready or not.
Yeah, and yeah, I find that there's also like an intertwined problem of toxic masculinity. So maybe if you're like the only person in a meeting room of 10 people, if you're the only woman in there, like, and you speaking up may make some people look at you weirdly, like that's gonna even impact you more, and it's gonna reinforce that imposter syndrome of like, it's not that is a dipshit, is that I'm not good enough, when in actuality it's actually is the problem, like you're not the problem. And there's also a snowball effect, right? You mentioned
Exactly.
not applying, and the snowball effect of that. And I'm going to also bring up another example from an entirely different industry, but basically this idea that if there are not people like you in a work environment, you're less likely to feel like you can succeed there. So
100%.
if people don't apply because they don't see people like them in the room, then you don't even create the chance for someone like them to be at that level. And it's also usually harder for minorities to be at the higher level of a company. I think that BBC article goes that into way more detail, so please go read that.
It's a great
like
one.
we're just two engineers, so we're trying our best. But the other example I wanted to give is actually, and it's still very much related to this. And if you're interested in this specific topic, I would highly recommend. It's basically a podcast that came out in 2018, so 6 years ago. It's pre-pandemic. Can you still remember that time? But
Makes
basically,
me feel old when you say
yeah, same. But it's actually from the screenwriting industry, so part of the the media industry, and it's two of the authors of Rick and Morty back then, before he created all those big problems. But basically, it's Dan Ardan and Jessica Gao that were basically the entire setup of the podcast is Jessica explaining to Dan, an old white guy, like how diversity and inclusion work,
Yeah.
especially in the environment. And she was very much explaining this problem of like, if I don't see anyone, you know, at the producer level being like me, I will not feel like I can apply or be part of that environment. And the reverse of that was also like something that she brought up a lot, which is we need to hire more people. We need to get them promoted. They need to be at the right position because they will then, especially in an industry like the media
Yeah.
industry, where a lot of the hiring happens by networking. So literally, once you have, by being at the top, you're not just like representing and like creating, you know, maybe reducing a bit the imposter syndrome of other people around you,
Yeah.
but also you're the person that will open the door for these other people, like
Yeah.
more literally, because this industry is very much like so, which
Yeah.
actually in a way is kind of also like our industry in a bit, like, you know, especially now when there's like a lot of people applying for a lot of roles and it
Yeah,
gets
for
very
sure.
frustrating very quickly. You know, networking is one of the key aspects. So yeah, I guess I've been rambling a bit, but basically it's very important to recognize how drastic imposter syndrome, what these effects, they can really, you know, have ripple effects in the entire industry.
Yeah, and I think like one of the things like I also notice a lot is diversity and inclusion. Like one of the main things that might end up lacking is as simple as empathy. Like if you don't have somebody who looks like you, who does what you do, how are they going to have empathy for, you know, the issues you may be feeling and the issues that you may be going through? Like it then manifests into imposter syndrome because you're like, I need to do this alone because if I don't, like, I'm going to be a failure, which is that soloist like approach, because you don't necessarily see someone being empathetic towards the issues you're facing. So it might make you feel like, okay, this is a me problem, and I need to tackle it myself. Otherwise, you know, I'm not going to get somewhere. And it really is just because there's nobody empathizing with you and your problems that you may be feeling.
Yeah, and this reminds me of another cartoon. Sorry, BoJack Horseman. There was this one scene in an episode where, like, it's a TV show, and the host basically say, "So we're gonna talk about abortion tonight, and we're gonna have three white men swing papillons talking about it." It's like this is the type of problem,
Yeah.
you know, like because like if you set up an environment in a way that just reflects your personal experience, you're not accounting for, you know, I'm a man. If I set up a work environment that works with my specific mindset and how it works for me, it may not work for someone else. It may not work for a lot of different people, but, you know, I don't have a period, for example. And that's something that is very impactful. And I remember like a few episodes ago, you know, Sarah Vieira was calling me out on that and explaining, like, you cannot understand this, but let me explain it to you. And that's the important bit, you know, like having someone or like being aware, like if you're not a minority, you need to be aware that there are things you cannot experience and you need to make room for that.
Yeah, you need to empathize. And I think like it is known, like, right, that maybe there are lots of studies that I've done that show like men are more solutionizers, women tend to be more empathized. I know that's generic, like that's creating like a stereotype, but it is also, there are a lot of studies that show that. And I think like when you end up like in, I know we're going into like a lot more gender roles and stuff, but I think the lack of empathy in the tech industry, and there's a lot of studies that show like, you know, there is this lack of empathy in the tech industry, I do feel like causes more imposter syndrome, not just for women but for men as well. Like if you're not empathetic to someone going through imposter syndrome, how are you going to be able to relate to them?
Yeah, and that can then lead to even worse mental health problems as well.
100%, yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, I wonder why people that prefer to talk with a screen that with another person have a problem with empathy. No, but so there's a lot probably going wrong in our industry, and that creates a lot of imposter syndrome. Like, what can we do about it? Like, if someone came to you today and like, hey, I feel a lot of imposter syndrome, like, what personal action could they take to kind of like try to soothe that a bit, or like work through it.
Yeah. So, I mean, the way I kind of handle it is talking to other people who are sort of more senior to me, and in a similar career trajectory or whatever, like, or subject matter experts, and just talking to them about sort of not just like why I'm feeling a certain way, but maybe what's causing it. So is it that I'm not like, so sometimes like in my role now, I'll give you an example. I end up writing articles and doing a little bit more of the softer side of tech. So sometimes when I'm, like deep in like a problem, like a coding problem, and you get stuck, right? And and I'm like, is this just me like having rusty coding skills, or is it just a typical bug? And it's just reaching out for help, even in the smallest of situations, can really help ease that imposter syndrome you're feeling. And so just talking to somebody who might know a little bit more, or you think might know a little bit more, they probably don't feel that way, helps ease it for me a lot more. Because sometimes it is just something really silly that you didn't pick up, or if it's like if I'm writing an article and I don't think it's gonna do very well, it's just getting somebody to read it and say like, actually no, like it makes sense. So yeah, I think reaching out for help and not being afraid to reach out for help.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And maybe just for like, to be clear, I don't think you need to have a pre-existing relationship with someone if you want to reach out and ask for help.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah,
Of course, like,
100%.
don't be weird. Try to be a decent human. Write well. If it's someone that you don't know, like, maybe take your time, write a longer email, and be a bit more empathetic. Be like, hey, by the way, you don't know me, but I
Yeah.
know you, and like, but like, it's okay to reach out to someone that you don't know yet for these type
Yeah,
of
I
situations.
think that's also the beauty of the tech industry is people are super willing to help. And I mean, it's the open source culture, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think that doing another one is doing things out in the open really does help with imposter syndrome, right? Like, I actually only wrote my first piece of like open source contributions. I know you, Lorenzo, you've been in the weeds with open source for ages, but I only felt confident enough to do it like 6 years into my career, and it was definitely imposter syndrome holding me back. But finding something that I could do like out in the open and like being able to contribute to a library that I use all the time also like really made me feel a little bit validated, like, okay, I'm not like totally crap at what I do. Like,
Nice.
I did manage to do it, and maybe it took longer, and that's okay. Like, I don't need to be a natural genius, but like doing it out in the open and like having that out there, like, it made me feel like, okay, this is something the community also thinks is valid and useful. So I think maybe also doing open source work might help with imposter syndrome.
Yeah, that's actually a good shout. Like, this type of external validation,
Yeah,
getting
external
validation through public
validation,
code.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's probably a good strategy as well. I never thought about it. Probably because, as you mentioned, like, I've been doing open source a lot
Yeah.
for many years. But like, yeah, that's probably, I don't think that's the reason why I started, but like, there's definitely a part of that. Also because, and I wanted to maybe dive a second on this, the aspect of celebrating your wins.
Yes, 100%.
I'm awful at that.
Yeah. No,
But that helps, right?
100%. Yeah. So one of the things, like, even in my current team, I'm trying to do is make sure every Friday, like, we just give people. We have a system called shout outs, like, and it takes 5 minutes, but it really helps validate that somebody is doing the right thing. And I think you're completely right. Celebrating the wins, like, no matter how big, no matter how small, is what companies should be doing. And I think in my talk, I do think I talk about, like, what can you do as an individual, what can you do as a community, and also what can you do as your company. And I think a lot of things, like, what can you do as an individual, aren't going to be as effective if you're not making the change, like, within your company. And it's not on you to do it, of course. Like,
Yeah.
companies should be more well aware, but that's not always the case. So if you can even just start that conversation, or like put in 5 minutes in everyone's calendars, like, make sure you're doing your shout outs or whatever your internal tool is called, I think it helps a lot, especially for me.
Nice. And when it comes to wins, basically, it's like completing a task, right? Like, it almost feels like when you finish a quest in a video game, and at the end, like when you're done, like there's a special
Yeah.
music that plays
Yeah.
out. Like you kind of need to be your own orchestra for that moment in a way,
Yeah.
because if not, like you're just gonna complete the task. Like, okay, next, and you're just gonna be back in the loop of like, oh, I'm having troubles doing this new thing. Like this gratitude practice is very, very important, especially
Yeah.
for imposter syndrome.
And
And
it's,
yeah,
I was gonna say, it's not just positive, right? Like even just like maybe scheduling more one-on-ones with your manager or mentor and being like, what am I doing well? What can I improve on? It helps you understand like what you might need to also improve on, and that might help you go down less of a rabbit hole of I need to improve on everything. Because it's like, okay, XYZ is what you need to improve on, instead of like, oh, I'm not good at anything at all.
yeah, that makes sense. And you already kind of brought it up, so let's dive into that. Like, in terms of like what companies should do, like what are some of the things that you may want to listen? Maybe we have some managers, some people who work in smaller companies or like in a more like C tier. Yeah, I wish I had C tier listeners, but you know, like if people that are more in this like ownership or responsibility position in a company wanted to do something about imposter syndrome, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I think the main one is having that open conversation. Like, make sure you have a space for people to be able to talk about imposter syndrome, but also like all the other aspects that come with imposter syndrome. You were saying, like, you know, anxiety, like maybe there are other mental health issues that can manifest from imposter syndrome. So having that open space to talk about it and being open about it, I think would be the main one. But then also creating the mechanisms that help, you know, people feel less imposter syndrome. Like create a system where there is like positive feedback, there's space for positive feedback, making sure you celebrate the wins, making sure that you have representation, you know, across the board of people with different skill levels. You know, sometimes I see it a lot, like, you know, someone junior may, you write a PR and, you know, someone senior might end up, you know, criticizing the code a little bit more than they should, without even like saying, hey, I think you did this small part really well. So it can be as simple as that, like when it comes to celebrating the wins, or it could be as good as giving people a space to also like for me, when I was at the beginning of my career, I got space to do talks, something like that. Like it's huge, right? Like it's giving someone the space to talk about their work and make them feel like their work is important and validated.
I think those are all great. It's challenging, I find, that to feel like you can like even express yourself at work. So having this type of maybe, you know, like you mentioned, like having a recurring meeting or having a one-off meeting literally to talk about the imposter syndrome, like call the things with their names. I think they are probably like the better way to start from, and then you can build on top and create these better practices in the company. So
Yeah.
I think those are super valid. And you know, you also did bring up communities. Like what? So when it comes to communities, I know that in tech we do have a few that are trying to be there to support people in underrepresented group in techs, like Code Bar. We
Yeah.
did have Women Who Code, which sadly just like shut down a couple of months ago, a month
Yeah.
ago or so, and that's very sad. But like, what do you feel is the role of these type of communities that are kind of like this in between personal life and work? Like, how do you think of them in the context of imposter syndrome?
I think like what's great about the communities is giving you that representation, right? Like you meet people who do what you do, who look like you, and you're able to have like those conversations with them about like their roles and like where, you know, their career may be going. I think that's the beauty of communities as well. It's just the networking effect you get from it, right? I mean, we met at a conference, right? Before that, I'd only ever seen you on GitHub, like, you know, creating the product that I use every day. Obviously, I was like, oh, yeah, like he's, you know, React Native's maintainer, like, knows exactly what he's doing. But then you meet each other and you're like, oh, Yeah.
They're like, oh, he's actually the one that should be, is the fraud. I found it.
No, not at all. But I mean, I got to have a conversation with you, being like, yeah, sometimes I don't even know how to contribute to open source because I feel scared. And it's as simple as just like having that space to have that conversation gives you the opportunity to like sort of attack your imposter syndrome and be like, no, like you don't control me. I'm going to do what I want to do. And I think that's the beauty of communities for sure.
It helps you empowers yourself, and also
Yeah.
has maybe a lower barrier to entry compared to, oh no, I'm gonna write this cold email to this person I never talked to, and maybe they will never reply.
Yeah.
So yeah, for sure, like especially if you have a local division of like something like Codebar, like we're gonna leave some links in the
Yeah, for
comments,
sure.
like in the description, so that you can maybe use that. And yeah, I think that's perfect. Like we covered a lot of type of actions. Hopefully some people will find it interesting. But if you had to summarize like our conversation so far, like if into like one key learning, if there's one thing that you want, the listeners to take out of this conversation, what would it be?
I think it would be have the conversation. Literally, whether it's with your peer or your manager or even just like, your mate at work drinks and they're not even in your career, it doesn't matter. Like whether you think it or not, like you are the expert at what you do, right? You have a skill that somebody else doesn't have. And it's just being able to see what you bring to the table. And that's only going to happen if you're talking to someone else. Like, I really like the rubber ducky method. Like I use it for more than just talking through my code. I'm also like, when I'm writing an article, I'm also like talking out loud. Like, do I even feel like this is something that the community wants, right? And using it for like a little bit of validation, like, is also how I deal with it. But again, it boils down to having that conversation, whether it's with your peers or whether it's with a rubber duck. Like, I don't care, just have a conversation. Hopefully it's not a rubber duck, like you will find somebody.
Nice.
But my key
Awesome.
learning, have a conversation.
Yeah, +1 to that. And also because most times you will realize that, again, the other person you were looking up to, that you thought, oh my God, they're perfect, they know everything. They're just another human being.
Yeah.
They're just faking it out as we all do. So yeah, I think this is a great key learning to end this conversation on. Anisha, thank you so much for being here with me. I
Thank
super
you.
appreciated it.
Thank you so much.